Imagine, imagine you are listening to a song being played on this 100-year-old wooden guitar.
Right.
But instead of a comforting campfire melody, it sounds like the soundtrack to a futuristic horror movie.
Yeah, totally unsettling.
Exactly. Like the strings are vibrating from another dimension. There's this hypnotic, suffocating hum just swallowing the background. And there's this frantic, almost unhinged energy to the whole thing.
Mm.
So, welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is pulling from a really massive, incredibly thorough column from MMR. And we're exploring this exact bizarre intersection.
A really wild space.
It is. It's this collision of traditional earthy acoustic music with like absolute avant-garde noise. And it's generally known as experimental folk or psych folk.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating landscape to explore because it fundamentally messes with our expectations.
Oh, for sure.
When you hear the word folk, your brain immediately cues up, like a guy on a wooden stool singing about a train or a breakup.
Right, some guy with a harmonica.
Exactly. It's supposed to be rootsy and organic and, well, safe. The source material we are pulling from today charts what happens when artists take that safe, ancient foundation and completely shatter it.
Okay, let's unpack this because I want to make sure you listening to this know exactly what we're getting into here.
Yeah, it's not standard singer-songwriter stuff.
Right. We are not talking about some indie artist who bought a new delay pedal for their acoustic guitar. The metaphor that kept hitting me while reading this MMR column, think of experimental folk as a wooden cabin in the woods.
Okay, I like that.
But instead of a cozy fireplace, it's wired with fiber optics and tape loops and like alien technology. You are using the most ancient, limited tool imaginable to create something violently new.
Yeah, and that tension is the entire point.
Yeah.
I mean, the MMR writer makes this really compelling thesis right up front.
Mm-hmm.
Experimental folk is not a genre.
Wait, really? Not a genre at all?
Not the traditional sense, no. You can't put it in a neat sonic box with a bow on it. Instead, the author argues it is a methodology.
Oh, interesting.
Right. It's defined by the very act of acoustic-based sonic experimentation. So the acoustic instrument is the anchor, keeping the music tethered to the earth, but the point of the art is the wild, rule-breaking experimentation swirling all around it.
Which is why I think we have to talk about the actual toolkit these artists are using before we get into the timeline of who did what.
Definitely.
Because the source keeps describing these songs as otherworldly and unsettling. But mechanically, what is actually happening?
Right, like how do you actually do that?
Yeah. If I'm holding a standard acoustic guitar, how do I make it sound like it's melting?
Well, the source breaks down a few specific techniques that literally alter the physical sound wave. The first is a really heavy reliance on dissonance.
Okay.
In standard pop or folk, you play chords that resolve nicely. They sound pleasing to the human ear.
Sure, they feel finished.
Exactly. But in this movement, artists intentionally play notes that clash. And that creates this immediate psychological tension in the listener. Then they lean heavily on unconventional open tunings and microtones.
Wait, let me stop you there for a second.
Sure.
For anyone listening who hasn't spent, like, hours staring at a guitar fretboard, what does an open tuning actually do to the sound?
That's a great question. So normally, a guitar is tuned in a specific standardized way so you can form chords with your fingers.
Right.
An open tuning means you literally twist the tuning pegs so that when you strum the guitar without pressing any strings down at all,
Just totally open.
just totally open, it plays a full, often really strange chord. And because you aren't muting any strings with your hands, the strings just ring out continuously.
Oh, so it just keeps echoing.
Yes, they vibrate against each other, creating a massive resonant sound. And when you combine that with microtones, which are the hidden pitches that exist in the cracks between the standard keys on a piano.
Into notes we aren't supposed to play.
Exactly. You get a sound that bends in a way our Western ears just aren't used to. It sounds slightly off or woozy.
And then you throw drones on top of that, because the column mentions drones constantly.
Oh, constantly. A drone is simply a sustained, continuous note or chord that never stops.
Like a bagpipe kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or imagine a synthesizer, a church organ, or like a bowed cello, just holding one long, unchanging, heavy note in the background for 10 minutes.
Wow.
It completely removes the traditional sense of rhythm and replaces it with atmosphere. It can feel deeply meditative or, in the case of a lot of these artists, incredibly suffocating.
And the source also points out the collision of cultures happening in this toolkit. It's not just Western guitars. They are hauling in sitars, the darbuka, mixing non-Western instrumentation with this psychedelic focus on mysticism and folk tales and, altered states of consciousness.
Yeah, a lot of old world mysticism.
But here's the thing I kept bumping up against while reading this, and this is where it gets really interesting to me.
What's that?
If your ultimate goal as an artist is to make weird, dissonant, otherworldly noise, why stick to an acoustic guitar or a banjo at all? Why not just boot up a computer and use a synthesizer from the jump?
Yeah.
Synthesizers are literally built to make alien sounds.
I wondered the exact same thing, but the source offers a brilliant explanation for this. It comes down to friction.
Friction, okay.
Yeah, a synthesizer is an inherently synthetic machine, right? When you use a computer to make a weird electronic sound, it's just a machine talking to a machine. There's no surprise there.
It does what it's supposed to do.
Exactly. But an acoustic instrument is earthy. It's unrefined. It's the literal physical sound of a human fingernail scraping across a brass wire, echoing inside a hollow piece of wood.
Oh, man. I see where this is going.
Right. When you take that hyper-organic, flawed human sound and you violently process it,
Yeah.
like when you run that physical scrape through a spinning magnetic tape loop, or you digitally reverse the sound of the hollow wood, or drench it in exaggerated reverb, the contrast is staggering.
That makes so much sense.
The simplicity of the acoustic instrument actually acts as a blank canvas.
Okay.
It leaves more room for the manipulation to stand out. Electronic music alone just can't achieve that level of stark, unsettling contrast.
It's the tension between the ancient and the futuristic. Like, if you see a spaceship in space, it's normal.
Sure.
But if you see a spaceship parked in a medieval village, it's terrifying.
That is a perfect analogy.
That contrast is the magic. So let's trace this back. Who first realized you could use an acoustic guitar as a weapon of weirdness? Because the timeline in this MMR column starts way back in the late 1960s.
Yeah, the 1960s psychedelic movement is where the seeds are planted, specifically over in the UK.
Okay.
This is the era of the British folk revival colliding with acid culture, creating what was called acid folk. You had groups like the Scottish duo, the Incredible String Band.
Oh, right. They brought in a lot of Eastern influences.
Exactly. They were the pioneers of bringing in those non-Western sitars and adopting these rambling, ritualistic song structures that totally abandoned the standard verse-chorus verse format.
The UK act that takes up a massive chunk of this column, though, is a band called Comus.
Yes.
And I never heard of them before reading this, to be honest. But the way the author describes their 1971 debut album, First Utterance, is just intense.
Oh, it is deeply intense.
The text says it features heavily dissonant acoustic guitars, frantic, unhinged flute and violin arrangements, and eerie theatrical vocals.
I mean, this does not sound like peace and love hippie folk at all.
No, it wasn't. Comus was aggressive. They took the acoustic framework and essentially created a blueprint for dark folk.
Wow.
It was music that felt like it was tapping into ancient, menacing, pagan rituals in the woods. The strumming was violent, the vocals were practically shrieks.
But here's the wild detail from the text. They were a commercial failure.
Total flop.
Yeah, the album flopped, and the band basically disappeared shortly after. So my question is, how does a total commercial failure from 1971 become the primary foundation for a massive experimental movement decades later? Well, what's fascinating here is that it highlights a really important difference in how music history works.
How so?
In mainstream pop, influence is dictated by massive radio play and millions of sales, right?
Right.
But in the experimental underground, influence operates like a secret society. Comus provided this dark folk template that was arguably way too shocking for a general audience in 1971.
Too far ahead of their time.
Way too far ahead. But that record ended up in the hands of obsessive record collectors and other avant-garde musicians. It lay dormant. It basically acted as a secret handshake for later generations who were desperately looking for a way to make acoustic music sound dangerous.
Okay, so the UK has this dark, theatrical, collective acid folk scene, but the column paints a completely different picture of what was happening in America at the exact same time.
Yeah, very different vibe.
Like, the US didn't have a cohesive movement. It was just a bunch of isolated, solitary weirdos experimenting in their living rooms.
Well, isolated visionaries might be a nicer way to put it, but yes.
Fair enough.
The 1970s American scene was deeply introspective. It was about solitary experimentation. You had John Fahey, who was just a towering figure in this world. He pioneered what's called American primitive guitar playing.
Wait, what does that actually mean, American primitive?
So he took traditional old-school acoustic fingerpicking, the kind of bluesy country style you'd hear on a porch in the 1920s.
Okay.
But he approached it with the mindset of an avant-garde composer. He would introduce intense dissonance, bizarre tuning structures, and long, repetitive drone motifs. He essentially treated the acoustic guitar like a solitary laboratory.
That sounds incredible.
It is. And you also had artists like Tim Buckley in his late career actively tearing apart the structure of folk music by injecting complex, totally unpredictable jazz phrasing into it.
And the ultimate example of the solitary mad scientist in this column has to be Linda Bratt.
Oh, absolutely.
Her album Parallelograms came out in 1970, and the MMR writer specifically highlights her use of tape processing and choral work. Now, when we say tape processing in 1970, we are not talking about hitting a button on a laptop.
Not at all.
She was literally sitting in her house, taking physical magnetic tape, cutting it with a razor blade, taping it back together backwards, and manually looping the sound of her own voice over her acoustic guitar to create these swirling, psychedelic soundscapes.
Yeah, just incredibly painstaking physical labor. And much like Comus, Linda perhaps didn't find huge commercial success when that record dropped. She was incredibly far ahead of her time.
It's amazing for you to picture this as a listener. These isolated Americans tuning their guitars to strange frequencies, physically chopping up tape, just quietly laying down the architectural foundation for a movement that wouldn't actually explode until the 90s.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the next major leap the text covers, and it's a weird one.
It is a massive stylistic leap. The column moves us from the 70s folk hippies straight into the 1980s and 90s post-industrial scene.
And this is where my brain broke a little bit reading the source.
How so?
Because when you say industrial music, I immediately picture factories. I picture sheet metal being struck with hammers, harsh, static, heavy machinery noise, artists screaming over blown-out amplifiers.
Right, total noise.
So what on earth does that have to do with them suddenly picking up a hollow wooden guitar?
It sounds totally counterintuitive, I know. Why would the loudest, harshest musicians on Earth pivot to wood and wire? But the source introduces a crucial figure to explain this bridge, and that is David Tibet and his musical project, Current 93.
Yeah, the column positions Current 93 as the absolute linchpin of this era.
They are. The column traces Current 93's evolution from the heavy noise and industrial underground of the early 80s into the 90s, where they make this radical shift.
Right.
They largely dropped the heavy electronic distortion and pivoted to an acoustic-centric sound.
Wow.
Yeah, they started utilizing harmoniums, acoustic guitars, and instruments like the hurdy-gurdy, which, by the way, is this ancient mechanical stringed instrument that produces a continuous, haunting drone when you turn a crank on it.
But they didn't suddenly become a cheery folk band, right? The industrial dread came with them.
Oh, exactly the opposite of cheery. They realized that you don't need a wall of distorted amplifiers to create a feeling of heavy, imposing dread. You can achieve that entirely through atmosphere.
That is so cool.
The text points out that Current 93 directly inherited the eerie, unsettling legacy of Comus, but they combined it with something new: heavy mysticism and spoken word.
The spoken word element is so interesting to me. Instead of singing a melody, you just have this deeply serious, ritualistic poetry being recited over a droning acoustic loop.
Yeah, and the author notes that Current 93 essentially codified the modern formula for this dark subgenre. It was experimental methodology plus acoustic instrumentation plus solemn poetic reading.
Wow.
And when you strip music down to its barest bones, a rigidly strummed chord, a mechanical drone from a hurdy-gurdy, and a monotone voice, it can actually sound heavier and more apocalyptic than a standard heavy metal band. It's all about the meat.
And this methodology directly intersects with a subgenre the text identifies as neofolk. It brings up acts like Death in June and Sol Invictus.
Right.
And just to be completely clear for you listening, we're looking at this strictly from an architectural sound design perspective. The source material notes that while neofolk often sparks intense political debates, sonically, this movement took that psych folk trajectory and stripped it to its absolute minimalist core.
Absolutely.
Minimal instrumentation, repetitive atmospheric drones, and that rigid, solemn poetry we just talked about. It proves that heaviness is an acoustic property, not just a volume property.
Yeah, that intense, shadowy energy really defined the 90s underground. But as the column traces the timeline forward, that industrial-adjacent dread eventually gives way as we cross into the 2000s.
The shift happens.
Exactly. A new wave of convergence happens.
Right. The 2000s brings us the freak folk movement. It's like the heavy apocalyptic clouds part just a little bit, and we get this new psychedelia emerging. And the absolute champion of this 2000s revival, according to the text, is a band from Philadelphia called Espers, who formed in 2002.
Yeah, Espers is the perfect example of synthesis. They're the artists who took all the disparate elements from the previous 3 decades and successfully wove them together.
The column lists their sound profile, and it is essentially everything we've talked about today just thrown into a collider.
Totally.
You have the acoustic guitars and the harps, but they are absolutely swimming in modern drone synthesizers.
Right.
You have the complex, traditional vocal harmonies of the 1960s British folk revival, but they are layered and tranquil, completely avoiding the harshness of the 90s scene. It's like they took the eerie DNA of the avant-garde and polished it with modern sensibilities.
And that polish is what allowed them, along with other key 2000s acts mentioned in the source, like Devendra Banhart, Six Organs of Admittance, and the early work of Animal Collective, to build a crucial bridge.
A bridge to...
Well, they took the deeply weird, insular world of psych folk and connected it to the much broader indie rock and ambient music scenes. They essentially made the avant-garde accessible to a wider audience.
Which brings us to where we are right now.
Yeah.
The column brings the timeline up to the 2010s and the 2020s, and it makes a pretty bold claim. It says the genre boundaries have completely dissolved. They just don't exist anymore.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the labels really do start to fail at this point. The text introduces the modern drone folk era.
He's right.
It highlights artists like Earth, a band that actually originated in the incredibly heavy drone metal scene of the 90s, who later transitioned to playing slow, sprawling acoustic and clean electric music.
That's quite a pivot.
It is. Or artists like Grouper. The source highlights how modern experimental folk is seamlessly integrating chamber music strings, modern digital tape processing, and field recordings.
I always find field recordings fascinating.
They're great.
For those unfamiliar, that's when an artist literally takes a microphone out into the real world, captures environmental audio like a rainstorm hitting a tin roof, or a distant train hum, or people talking in a cafe, and weaves that raw audio file directly into the musical composition.
It adds another layer of organic texture. So in a modern track, you might hear a beautifully intricate acoustic guitar piece, heavily processed through a digital delay pedal, hovering over a low synthesizer drone, with the literal sound of a rainstorm playing beneath it.
That sounds beautiful, honestly.
It is. But at that point, is it ambient music? Is it chamber folk? Is it acoustic minimalism? The overlaps are so heavy that trying to categorize it is totally pointless.
And that inability to categorize it leads perfectly to the core takeaway that the author of this MMR column leaves us with. Experimental folk is no longer a genre you can put in a neat, easily labeled box. It is a methodology. It's a creative process. It is the act of using an acoustic foundation as an anchor to connect completely disparate alien elements. You can hear the violent theatrical strumming of Comus, the solemn poetic experiments of Current 93, and the lush, layered synthesizer arrangements of Espers all happening at the exact same time in today's music.
They've all become available tools in this ongoing methodology. And really, it's a massive testament to what happens when you impose limitations on art.
How do you mean?
Well, the acoustic instrument has physical limits. It only has 6 strings. It relies on a hollow body to project sound. By embracing those limitations, these artists were forced to find entirely new, radical ways to break the rules.
It really is an incredible sonic journey for you to think about. Taking the most traditional, primitive tools human beings have, a piece of hollow wood and some taut strings, and treating them not as a museum piece to be preserved, but as a blank canvas for totally boundless audio adventure.
It is. But as we wrap up this history, there's a final thought the source material provoked for me, something I think is worth turning over in your mind after you finish listening today.
Oh, I love a good final thought. Let's hear it.
So we've established that the acoustic guitar allowed for this deep, radical experimentation precisely because of its primitive simplicity. It was the organic baseline that artists manipulated.
Right.
But what does the next generation of folk music look like?
Oh, wow. That's an interesting angle.
Right. Because technology moves so fast. 50 years from now, will the digital synthesizers and bulky laptops we use to make electronic music today be viewed as the new, primitive, rustic baseline?
That is wild.
Will the avant-garde artists of the 22nd century look at a 2024 MacBook the way the artists of the 1970s looked at a wooden guitar? Will they deconstruct it, break it, and experiment on it to create whatever the future version of folk music sounds like?
A MacBook becoming a rustic folk instrument, man, That is a wild visual, and it's definitely going to keep me up tonight.
Me too.
And we hope it keeps you thinking too. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the strange, beautiful, and sometimes terrifying world of experimental folk. We highly encourage you to go out, dig up some of these artists, and experience the glorious dissonant noise for yourself. Try to find the friction between the old world and the new. Until next time, keep diving deep.